Well, my lords, ladies and gentlemen, your excellencies, let me welcome you all to the Global Strategy Forum, but alas, not Lord Lothian, who should be in this chair. Like so many of us today, he is stuck in traffic trying to get across London. And so, haplessly, I'm James Kidner. I'm a friend of the Global Strategy Forum, as we all are in this room, and have been for many years. And I was the hapless first guest in the room who Jacqueline seized upon to say, would you mind stepping in if the traffic continues bad? So my apologies that it's me and not him, as it were. We're hoping that he will join us shortly. We're here to listen to Sir Laurie Bristow talking about Russia and Ukraine, but I first need to have a couple of housekeeping notes to you all. We've got, apart from the mass ranks of the people in this room, a large number of people watching online. And so I would ask those online who sadly can't actually contribute to the discussion except by writing in their questions, which will then come up on this magnificent teleprompt, and we will bring in your questions after the talk, but you missed a very good lunch, and my apologies for that. The second housekeeping note is to alert you to the fact that next Wednesday, the ambassador of Jordan will be coming in to give a talk about his country's perspective on the Middle East crisis. Very topical. That's at 12:30 next Wednesday here in this room, and again online. And do please sign up with Jacqueline if you'd like to come here, otherwise there won't be any sandwiches for you. Any other housekeeping notes? Let me just check my notes. No. Let me get on to welcome Laurie Bristow. Laurie has been a friend of mine in the Foreign Office for many years and had a very distinguished career, dare I say it, much more distinguished than mine. One of the nerve-wracking issues of sitting in this chair at the front here is that you see no fewer than about half a dozen of your old bosses sitting balefully in the front row, keeping an eye, mostly I hope, on Laurie, but also now on me. Laurie had a very distinguished career, ending up as our ambassador in Afghanistan, but before that in Russia and in Azerbaijan, a very distinguished career of being a Russian expert. He's now a distinguished fellow at RUSI, and his day job, if you like, is president of Hughes Hall in Cambridge. It's wonderful to have you here with us, Laurie. You're going to talk about, well, I will give the formal title that you're going to talk to, because it's always disconcerting to have the exam question changed at this last minute. You're going to talk about Russia's war in Ukraine, the global fallout, and how does it end. Laurie, you've got about 20 minutes to answer this question.
Brilliant, thank you, and thanks very much for the invitation. So, my favourite meme of the last 10 days so far is a tweet that Steve Rosenberg, the BBC correspondent in Moscow, put out. And it's the impolite version of what just happened. And it's in very large letters in English in the back windscreen of a car driving through the middle of Moscow. I don't think it really makes sense for me to talk about Russia and what's happening and where this goes without starting with trying to make sense of the last 10 days. I mean, in a fairly richly populated field of weird things I've seen happen working on Russia, this is one of the stranger, but I think it tells us probably quite a lot about what some of the answers are to the questions that we're trying to address. So what I'll do is start, first of all, with a quick just run through on Wagner, the Wagner Group. What is it? What do we think just happened? So it's a private military company of a sort belonging to Yevgeny Prigozhin. Prigozhin is a man, a prominent Russian, I wouldn't say a first-rank Russian securocrat with a criminal past. Came to Putin's attention through the restaurant business of all things. He acquired a number of lucrative Kremlin catering contracts. That translates from Russian as a license to print money, of course, which is a big part of what this is about. He made himself useful to the Kremlin essentially as a subcontractor for the Kremlin's dirty work. In particular, the Wagner Group and the Internet Research Agency, a troll farm based in St. Petersburg. I mean, the Internet Research Agency in particular, I think, is best understood as an instrument of hybrid warfare. Think of it as, KGB active measures, but updated for the modern age. I first started tracking this stuff over a decade ago when a large number of very similar talking points with very similar and typically Russian grammatical errors started appearing in the readers' comments sections of the international and London media. They've smartened their act up a bit, got lots more resources, but it's still essentially the same model. Both are best understood, though, not as private companies, but as arm's-length instruments of the Russian state, used for a typically Russian mix of geopolitics and private enrichment. Or you can put it the other way around if you want, because I think they're fungible. Wagner, as a business proposition and a geopolitical tool, was based initially on a simple and very compelling offer to incumbents in resource-rich but poorly governed countries, but typically in sub-Saharan Africa. And the deal is this: we will provide security in exchange for a cut of the spoils. The security is no questions asked, and literally no questions asked. As a tool of war fighting, which is what it developed into, I think the key feature here is, some people call it plausible deniability. I call it implausible deniability. There's this wonderful Russian word, vranyo, which I once translated for a Secretary of State for Defense as epic bare-faced whopper that we both know cannot possibly be true, but I'm going to tell you anyway. This is a big part of how the system works. So it was used in Syria and in Ukraine. It's been important in Ukraine since 2014 to preserve the very, very thin fiction that Russia is not a party to the war in the Donbass. And in Syria, of course, it provides a cutout. Most famously and extremely, where Wagner forces came into contact with US forces in 2018. US forces killed a number of them, and the response from the Kremlin was nothing at all. Nothing to see here, they're not ours. So they were essentially disowned. More recently, they've been used in Ukraine alongside the regular army to strengthen the military capability in a failing war. Although the relationship with the army and with the chain of command, as I think we've all been seeing, is very, very uneasy, to say the least. So to summarize, Wagner, I think, is best understood as an arm's-length instrument of the Russian state. It's symbiotic in its relationship with the Kremlin, and its criminality and the nature of that symbiosis is not an aberration. This tells you a lot about the Russian state and how it works. The Kremlin encouraged the formation of a large private army, technically illegal in Russia, channeled resources in its direction, and used it to deliver state policies. That's the nature of the Russian state. I describe it as a witch's brew of violence, money, political expediency, private enterprise, rent-seeking, and cronyism. So what just happened? Russia's invasion has been going badly since pretty much day one. I would say actually about day -10. It's a bad idea, even more poorly executed. Wagner provided a means of recruiting a large number of very, very violent men, some of them recruited directly from prison to bolster that regular army. Prigozhin himself seems to have used Wagner as a means of building his own position and influence within the elite as well as his personal wealth. And the siege of Bakhmut went on for an unreasonably long time, killed an unreasonably large number of men on both sides for a military objective of questionable importance other than propaganda importance, was meant as a means to prove Wagner and Prigozhin's ability to deliver state policy where the regular army had failed to do so, and in the process to gain control of resources, power, prestige, and influence. But the battle also brought to a head the personal rivalry between Prigozhin, Defense Minister Shoigu, and Chief of the General Staff Gerasimov. If you haven't seen it, I recommend just take a look at the expletive-filled rants on YouTube that Prigozhin put out. I won't quote it in its entirety, but the quote that springs to mind is, "Shoigu, Gerasimov, send the effing ammunition." This is direct to air on YouTube. On the 10th of July, the Russian MOD announced that all volunteer fighters would be brought into the regular army by the 1st of July. That was a clear signal that Prigozhin was being squeezed out by his enemies in the Ministry of Defense, his rivals in the Ministry of Defense, who were winning Putin over to their side of the argument. That infuriated Prigozhin. On the 23rd of June, he took to the air again, accusing Russian forces of attacking his men, openly and bitterly criticizing the conduct of the war and the senior military leadership, but also actually rejecting the whole basis of the war, that this was about denazifying Ukraine, it was about demilitarizing Ukraine and preventing Ukraine from joining NATO or attacking Russia. None of it, of course, true, but that's the basis of the Russian propaganda effort from the start. As if that wasn't enough, he then launched a rebellion. So he pulled Wagner fighters out of Ukraine, somehow took control of the southern military district headquarters in Rostov-on-Don. This is the key command and control center and the logistics hub for the war in Ukraine. And one of the stranger videos in the whole sequence then somehow appeared of him with two senior Russian military figures. I still haven't worked out whether it's an attempt to defuse the situation or a hostage video or some strange combination of the two. You take your pick. He then announced that he would press on to Moscow, not a military coup, but a, quote, march of justice. And his men were well on the way up the Russian M4 through Saturday, for the most part facing little or no resistance. Putin made a broadcast to the nation on Saturday morning, the 24th of June. He was more angry, I think, than I have ever seen him in that video. He referred to traitors in wartime and to a, quote, stab in the back, putting the country at risk of civil war. That, of course, means and is instantly recognizable to all educated Russians as the collapse of the Russian Imperial Army in 1917 and, of course, the Bolshevik Revolution that followed. The implication is clear that the state is threatened by treason from within at a time when it's under existential threat from the West and its Ukrainian proxy. The Wagner Telegram channel then commented that Putin had made the wrong choice and Russia would soon have a new president. So Prigozhin's men were beetling off up the M4 they got to Voronezh. They were making progress towards Moscow itself. Along the way, they seem to have shot down several Russian military aircraft and killed maybe 20 Russian servicemen. Meanwhile, Russian forces were paralyzed and seemed incapable of mounting an effective response. I've yet to see any good explanation of why that's so. My own take on it is that there's almost certainly a big dose of wait and see in there. So commanders essentially not wishing to jump the wrong way in a potentially very big, very violent confrontation between the big beasts. Russian security forces resorted, and this is seen on television, Russian television, resorted to digging up the roads to try to impede their advance. And a counter-terrorism operation was announced in Moscow, something not unakin to martial law in the capital. But a few hours later, the same day as Putin's broadcast, Prigozhin suddenly announced he was standing his men down to avoid bloodshed. The Kremlin said it would not be pressing charges. There was a deal reported, allegedly brokered by the president of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, under which Prigozhin would take himself off to Belarus. So even 10 days on, there are some really crucial things we do not know about what happened. What was Prigozhin's plan? Was he trying to force concessions from the Kremlin? I would guess being allowed to keep Wagner intact and under his control. Was he trying to force the removal of rivals? What did he plan to actually do, even when his men reached Moscow? Did he plan an armed insurrection against Russia's huge internal security forces? Did he expect Putin to up and leave? I mean, just what was going on there? Why was the Kremlin's response so late and initially so weak? I think probably the most coherent explanation of that is a function of Putin's well-established unwillingness to take difficult decisions under time pressure. And behind that, a signal of the very advanced state of degradation of the decision-making structures in the Kremlin. The US media have reported that US intelligence picked up signs in mid-June that Prigozhin was planning some sort of confrontation. Did the Russian agencies know that? It's implausible, I think, that they didn't. But if they did, what, if anything, did they do with the information? And if nothing, why not? Why did things resolve so quickly? What, if any, deal was made? Personally, I think it's deeply implausible that Lukashenko brokered anything at all. I mean, nobody serious in Moscow takes him seriously. That's just not the deal here. I think it's much more likely that he was a conduit through whom very, very prejudicial messages were passed, of the sort that if you wish to survive the day, you will bring this to a close now. So the quid pro quo, I don't know. It's just not really possible to tell yet, how this pans out. What can we deduce from all of this? My own take is that on the spectrum, with mutiny at one end and military coup at the other end, it's probably more towards the mutiny end of the spectrum, but with all of those big unanswered questions that I've outlined. Mark Galeotti's described it as an exercise in coercive negotiation. I think that's probably right. A struggle for control of military resources and positional power, and an attempt to regain the initiative, but in which things seem to have got badly out of hand and run ahead of themselves. As for Putin, I think he seems to have left things far too late and let them get out of control. And I think that's what we've been seeing since, an attempt to recover the initiative there. So what happens next? We've been seeing now for some days Russian domestic propaganda trying to convey Putin's authority and grip and to airbrush out all of the difficult questions. Of course, they have almost complete control of the television and news media they do have complete control of the television and news media in Russia, and almost complete control now of the information space. The authorities have been very keen to establish an outward semblance of normality and control, and as always, they're pivoting towards blaming the foreigners. So this is all a CIA plot. Shoigu has reappeared. That, of course, is a deliberate signal, although, of course, it may also not mean lasting endorsement for Shoigu. It's really hard, to me at least, to see how Prigozhin can be allowed to get away with it. What he's done has seriously undermined Putin's prestige and standing. I think the thing to look for here is deferred revenge, but I'll come along a bit later to some problems about that. So, some big dilemmas for the Kremlin now. First of all, trying to balance creating the appearance of normality and control with the need for repression and revenge. The instinct, I think, is always towards deeper repression, including quite likely purges. There's nothing in Russia's recent or further past that would suggest anything else. But Putin does need the military on side. He needs the security forces on side. And the failing war in Ukraine, of course, is still falling most heavily on the soldiers fighting it. The balance of domestic security versus the war in Ukraine, I think, is now likely to become a serious issue. And of course, in this system, regime security is always absolutely top of the pile. And that in turn depends on Putin's aura, an aura of invincibility and irreplaceability. I think the war in Ukraine and what's happened in the last 10 days has now clearly started to undermine that, with Putin starting to be seen as a driver of insecurity and instability, not a guarantor of security, particularly for the elites and their interests. Does Russia have the resources to guarantee regime security and to prosecute the war in Ukraine alongside each other? I don't know, but that looks to me to be one of the really big questions to look at. And finally, the question that I think has been the only serious question in Russian politics for about a decade is the succession. What happens after Putin, and particularly what happens next year. Next year is a presidential election year in Moscow. Elections, of course, are not a time in Russia where the voters choose the leader. It's the time when they validate the choice made by the leader. And I think they've just made that process much, much harder. And of course, one of the things, and again, one of the memes going around is the Swan Lake moment. That moment when television stops broadcasting the news and they put Swan Lake on instead. Every Russian of a certain generation and background knows exactly what that means. And I think we came quite close to that 10 days ago. So what does it mean? This is nowhere near the final act in this drama. I think we just passed a very big but a still ill-defined turning point in Russia's domestic politics. It's a domestic crisis. It has its roots in Putin's decision to invade Ukraine in the first place and in the series of shocking strategic blunders that he and his people have made from even before the beginning of the war. It's a self-inflicted injury. He's pulled out his six-shooter and blown a hole in his own foot, and it tells us a lot about the state of decision-making in Moscow. Beyond that, it also reflects, I think, the systemic failings of the Russian state. Weak institutions, patronage networks, competing interests, and rent-seeking. Putin's response made the damage a whole lot worse. It's made the thing personal because this is such a personalized regime. He's looking weak and incompetent. The reference to 1917 on the Saturday, I think, was a very, very serious error. It implies that revolution inside Russia, driven by Russians, is a serious prospect and a serious threat to Putin's rule. I think it's too soon, though, to say whether this individual episode will prompt a serious challenge to the regime from within. That, of course, will be an insanely risky venture for anyone to undertake, unless it succeeded. Street protests, I think, are very unlikely to produce a democratic uprising. I just don't see the conditions there for that. And what we haven't seen in the last 10 days is an outpouring of pro-Kremlin sentiment on the streets or indeed anywhere else. And I think what that tells us is that the Kremlin is counting on and will probably get a high degree of passive acquiescence from the broader population. I'd expect the episode to worsen the infighting and disarray in the military and security forces leadership and to worsen the already poor morale amongst Russian troops. And it doesn't inspire confidence in any form of leadership in the country. It isn't clear what happens to large numbers of Wagner soldiers, some of the more capable fighters in Russia's armed forces. But none of this means that the war in Ukraine will be a walkover for the Ukrainians. The Russians are dug in, they're well equipped, Ukraine's counteroffensive is making progress, but it is not and will not become, I think, a rout. I see no chance that the Kremlin will give up its fundamental aims here of subjugating or breaking Ukraine. So a few observations before we go into the Q&A about the wider meaning. I think Putin's standing amongst his supporters has almost certainly taken a very, very big dent. Of these, by far the most important is Xi Jinping. In China, Russia had already, I think, set itself on an inexorable path to junior partner status with China. Good luck with that. But Russia's value to China is as an ally. That value may have just been diminished. Xi has so far not been prepared to invest heavily in Putin's failing adventure. But it's, of course, not in Xi's interests for Putin's endeavor to fail. What China wants is to focus on its long-term strategic competition with the US, and it wants Russia as an ally in that. I think we should now keep a fairly close eye on how Russia's latest debacle shapes China's approach. For example, will we see a new initiative coming forward to try and broker a ceasefire, to try and bring this to some sort of equilibrium? Russia's perceived power in the former Soviet Union and elsewhere, I think, is now even more in question than it was 3 weeks ago, alongside questions, say no more than that at the moment, around the reliability and stability of the regime. So we may see some countries in the former Soviet Union and some others, I have in mind particularly India, Turkey, South Africa, the middle powers, starting to adjust their thinking accordingly. But I don't think that that will necessarily translate into closer alignment with the G7, with the West, particularly over things like sanctions. I think we'll probably continue to see hedging by a large number of countries in the global south because their hierarchy of interests is different from ours. So India is buying cheap oil from Russia. There are widespread concerns over the availability and cost of food in sub-Saharan Africa. The issue here, I think, was put most clearly by the Indian External Affairs Minister. We may not like the wording, but I think it's a point well made. Europe, I think meaning the West, has to grow out of the mindset that Europe's problems are the world's problems, but the world's problems are not Europe's problems. So Russia and the West, look, there is no relationship between Russia and the West at present, meaningfully. The propaganda machine is already saying that the hand of Western intelligence agencies is at work. That's standard practice for Russian propaganda, and its purpose is to rally support behind the leader and to obscure responsibility for his responsibility for Russia's failures. But it also reflects the Kremlin's deep paranoia and weak understanding of how Western countries really work. And it reinforces the Russian leadership narrative that the invasion was necessary because Russia faced an external threat from the West. The conclusion I draw from that is that we should hold our nerve in supporting Ukraine, but avoid doing the Russian propaganda machine's work for it by speculating about the disintegration of Russia, which I don't think is going to happen, or loose talk about regime change. So how does it end? As I said earlier, Russia's underlying war aims are a product of how Putin and the people around him see Russia and its place in the world. Those views will not change. And it's a delusion, I think, to think that there will be or can be a lasting settlement or peace until Russia itself fundamentally changes. That, in turn, will not happen while Putin is in power, and it may not happen for a long time after that. So I think we need to see this now as a generational process in Russia, one that engages electoral cycles in democratic countries and in a world where all sorts of other things will be coming at us, competing for attention and resources. I think we're already seeing that. As regards Russia, I think we're looking at a long and very difficult transition in Russia, during which time Ukraine will need some kind of security guarantees to ensure its survival and to maximize the chances of Ukraine succeeding as a law-based democracy. Although it's not a direct NATO-Russia confrontation, and both sides have been very careful to avoid it becoming one, this is about wider European security and about the future of the rules-based international system, apart from whether they agree with the formula. It's clearly not in our interests for a crypto-fascist Russia to be the dominant military power in Europe, or for Russia's assault on the UN Charter and on international law effectively to set new norms. It is very much in our interests for Ukraine to win and for Russia to lose, but it's not yet possible to define precisely what those things look like, absent a complete victory for either side on the battlefield, which I think is unlikely from here. And I think we're also nowhere near a negotiation yet. So I think the war has some way to run before we are there. I think, though, it is possible, and it's in some ways necessary now, to sketch out at least some elements of what an end to the conflict might involve. So first, it's inconceivable we should put out of our minds that Putin will accept Ukraine as a real country exercising sovereign choice and becoming part of the West. Everything about Russia's behavior in the last 3 decades suggests that if Russia seeks to freeze the conflict, it will do it in a certain way. It will seek to freeze the conflict on terms advantageous to Russia and then wait and regroup for a more propitious moment. That tells us something about what we have to avoid here. It's a Minsk III agreement. For Ukraine's supporters, our strategic interests, I think, lie in 2 closely linked outcomes. First, Ukraine survives as a nation and makes a successful transition to a democratic, law-based country. Second, Russia is successfully deterred or contained from seeking to prevent that outcome. One cannot be achieved without the other, and both imply an open-ended commitment from Ukraine's supporters, and therefore our staying power for as long as this takes. Final point, this is often described as Ukraine's war of independence. I think it is, but I also, and actually primarily, describe it as another of Russia's wars of succession. We have very, very little influence over what happens in Russia next, and my own view is it's quite unwise to try to exert influence inside Russia. I think at this stage, though, the best I can offer is that we should be very clear with the Russian people, those who are prepared to listen to us, that we are open to a different kind of relationship with Russia if and when that is what Russia wants. Thank you.
Fascinating. Well, listen, Laurie, this has been a tour de force. It's been a real privilege to have been here. Just a very quick reminder that next Wednesday, 12:30, again in this room, Mana Dabas, the ambassador of Jordan, will be talking about the Middle East, the last event of the GSF before the summer break. But you could not have given us a better lift today in the very gloomy politics and geopolitics of Eastern Europe and beyond. So thank you very much, Laurie.